over to you, Emma, to talk about managing depression in the workplace, a systematic review.
So hold that thought, as a matter of fact, because we're actually going to take a little step backwards, because managing depression in the workplace project was actually part of a much larger project, a 2-year project. So we just wanted to tell you a little bit about that project, given that it funded the Managing Depression project. So the larger project was called Evidence and Context for Occupational Health and Safety. And this project was part of an inter-provincial research team, which is actually very exciting. The project was funded by Manitoba, and the co-leads or co-PIs for the project were Dr. Stephen Bornstein, who's at Memorial University in Newfoundland, and me. And our team also was representative of 3 provinces. So we had a team based here at the Institute for Work and Health. My colleagues in that team are in blue on the slide, and we had colleagues in Manitoba and also Newfoundland. And then we had a fairly large stakeholder group. We called them the MSAC, which is the Manitoba Stakeholder Advisory Committee in Manitoba, whom we also worked with. So this was a really exciting project to be able to do something that we found very interesting across 3 provinces. So the project objectives were to develop and then test. We had 1 whole year which is piloting this project. An innovative approach for synthesizing current scientific knowledge, or in this case, starting with 2 systematic reviews on questions identified as important and urgent by stakeholders, and then to tailor those syntheses for effective use in specific provincial and local contexts. So I'll come back to this in a little bit with a nice little graphic. And so basically what we're trying to do is, most often with evidence syntheses, it's aiming to ask the question, what works? So it provides you with something that tells you that, you know, whatever was the hypothesis was, whether that intervention did or did not work. And to see if they would also answer the additional question, will that work here? To try and make this more relevant to our stakeholder community. Why is context important and why will it work here? Well, I think we can think of a number of examples of why context is important, and for the purposes of speed, because I know that you want to find out the results of the review, just to highlight one of them is, can the intervention even be implemented in the jurisdiction in which you reside? But obviously there are a number of other contextual factors. I'm just sort of glossing over this. So to give you the nice graphic that I told you about, courtesy Kim, this was to take the research evidence that we found from all over the world and then contextualize it for 2 provinces. In this case, it was Newfoundland and Manitoba. Okay, so far? These are some of the contextual factors that we found, and this in and of itself could be a presentation in terms of how these various topics that we went through could be contextualized looking at these factors, and perhaps we'll do a plenary of that one day. So how did we do it? So we blended the unique features of 2 existing approaches, which is the Institute for Work and Health Systematic Review methodology, and also the contextualization synthesis process, which was at SafetyNet and Chesper in Newfoundland. And so once we blended the methodology, we applied it to existing systematic reviews. This was the pilot phase. This was year 1 of the study. And we did the pilot phase in Newfoundland. So we took 2 existing systematic reviews, contextualized them for Newfoundland, and then took the learning from that process, and then applied it to a brand new systematic review, which was a topic chosen by the MSAC in Manitoba. These are the 2 existing reviews that we used as part of the pilot phase, and we gave the MSAC a list of, I think, about 5 or so topics of systematic reviews that we thought were most relevant at this point in time, and had them vote. We were very pleased that they chose the topic of preventing work disability in workers with depression for a number of reasons. One, I think hopefully we all agree that it is extremely topical, and especially 2 years ago when we were doing this. But also, we already had done a systematic review on this topic, which was done for the Ministry of Health in Ontario. It was a CIHR-funded grant, and led by Dr. Andrea Ferlin in 2010. And we were really excited by what we found. In that review, we found 12 studies that made it to to data extraction and evidence synthesis, and 10 of those were randomized controlled trials, which we were quite surprised by, given that we were looking in the workplace. But at that point in time, there weren't enough studies to really give any strong evidence either for or against certain interventions, but we felt that it was really very promising because a lot of work was being done. So we're very excited, and we also knew how much literature had been published since, so we're so pleased that they picked this topic, which gave us the opportunity to update this review. What do we know about depression in the workplace? Well, the burden associated with managing depression in the workplace is quite extensive. Hopefully we're all increasingly becoming more aware of this. Workers with depression lose significantly more health-related productive time, have higher rates of absenteeism and short-term disability, and experience higher rates of job turnover than those without depression. So again, this is just to lead you into why we felt that this was a really important topic at this point in time. So with that, I'm going to turn off the projector and hand it over to Dwayne, who's going to tell you a little bit about what we did.
Thanks. So it's my job to tell you what we did, go over the methods, which is very important, but I want to make sure I leave enough time for Kim to tell you what the results are, because I'm sure that's why you're here. So the systematic review team consists of the three of us and Dr. Ron Saunders. And as Emma said, we were lucky to be able to interact with stakeholders from 3 different provinces, from Ontario, Manitoba, and from British Columbia. You didn't think I was going to go there, did you? You thought Newfoundland, but no. Over the course of the time in this project, we were able to interact with stakeholders from those 3 provinces in a variety of roles, from compensation boards, government, consultants, practitioners, researchers, and health and safety associations. So we got a lot of good feedback as we went through the review. I'll tell you a little bit more about how we did that in a moment. So systematic reviews at Institute for Work and Health can be characterized in 6 steps. First, you identify or develop the question, conduct a literature search to find the literature to help you answer that question, identify the relevant articles within that literature search to help you answer the question, do a quality appraisal of the relevant articles so that you can trust the answer to the question, and then you extract the data from those trustworthy, relevant articles to help answer the question. And then you synthesize it so you can provide a level of evidence of how to answer the question in workplaces. At the Institute, we have sort of mapped out how we interact with stakeholders. We interact with stakeholders multiple different ways. It's not always all of these, but often we do touch with or engage with stakeholders multiple times through this review. We were lucky to meet with many different people many different times in the input kind of meeting, as well as many different times in the reaction side of things. So once we had some results to share and get feedback back from the stakeholders. And of course, we're always after talking with the stakeholders to help us in disseminating the messages and results of our systematic review. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more detail about 1, 2, 3, and 6. I'm going to reserve the detailed description of quality appraisal and data extraction because of time, but if you have any questions about that, please ask. We love answering those. So our research question was to determine what intervention approaches to manage depression in the workplace have been successful and yielded value for employers in developed economies. So you can see we're framing this question pretty specifically. And the reason we frame the question pretty specifically is because we have to do a literature search to find the answer to that question. So we have categories of population, adult working age, have depression, intervention, which has to have some element of a work focus to it, and outcome, so relevant to employers. So the outcome has to be relevant to the workplace. And when there's an intersection with all of those, we gather those studies, and this is usually a very comprehensive search, but those are the ones that we look at. that are the intersection of those population of studies, if you will. Within that population of studies, we look at them to make sure they are relevant. Our search is comprehensive, and they may contain those categories, but they may not have exactly what we're looking for. And we need these categories in order to answer the question. So we ensure that they were work-focused interventions, had some element of the workplace involved. They were workers with depression, suffering depression. There was a comparison group so that we can trust the responses, and that the outcomes included stay at work, return to work, or recurrences as relevant outcomes for this. Now, having talked to a number of stakeholders over the project time, we wanted to be very clear that we did not look at the causes of depression or other aspects like PTSD, stress, anxiety, or burnout, or anything more serious in terms of serious mental disorders. So we were focused in our review. So that's the relevance. And then magic happened. We did a quality appraisal. And, this is our synthesis algorithm, how we come up with the messages and recommendations from a systematic review at the Institute for Work and Health. We focus on quality, quantity, and consistency. And so quality, based on our quality assessment, the quantity, the number of studies that we need to have together, and the consistency is the direction of the results. Are they saying the same thing? And when we have that, we can grade the level of evidence from strong to insufficient. We think that strong and moderate are the levels of evidence to provide recommendations and practice considerations for practitioners. Levels of evidence below that, we feel are not enough to make recommendations or practice considerations. So this algorithm has developed over a little bit of time and has had stakeholder input constantly. So we and the stakeholders, mostly from Ontario, agree that this is the way to present our messages from the results of a systematic review. Is that reasonably clear? All right. So then I can turn it over to Kim to tell you about those results.
Okay, this is always my favorite part of the systematic reviews, when we've weeded through all of these studies and we can actually start to see what is the answer to our question. And I'm going to start by showing you those 6 steps of the review. So we've taken them from being horizontally across the middle that Dwayne showed you and just positioned them here on the left-hand side of the screen. I always try to talk to this slide as long as I can, because, you know, a review takes a really long time, and we can get through this really fast and it'll look like it's easy peasy, but it's not actually that fast. So you can see the steps of the review. At the top, you can see which electronic databases that we searched. And here's an interesting thing I'd like you to notice. Once we've run the search and we remove articles that had been captured in multiple databases, so we've removed our duplicates, when Dwayne said we start with the articles captured by our search, that's that little blue center in that nice Venn diagram, that represents over 8,000 studies that we had to start with to look at. So those are not all studies that will answer our research question, but they all included terms from at least all 3 of those circles in our Venn diagram that put them into our net of studies, our search. And then we do the steps, the magic that Dwayne described earlier, and then we get to this point where we have identified what studies are relevant and of sufficient quality that we can trust their findings to help us answer the research question. And in this case, we have 27 studies that were either rated as medium or high quality studies in this review that can help us present evidence to answer that question. And Emma mentioned earlier that this is an update of a review that we published 2011 or 12? 10. Close. At that time, we had 12 studies. So over the last 6 or 7 years, we have seen a real growth in the literature. And I think if we were to start today, we would see even more studies available to help guide this question. Okay, probably talked to the slide long enough. So here's what we found. I'm going to give you a quick snapshot of where the studies came from and what they looked like. This is by jurisdiction. And so the first thing you can see is that most of the studies are from the European Union. That's not really surprising. Our colleagues that are studying this in that jurisdiction, sets of jurisdiction, have been looking at mental health in the workplace for longer. And so there are more published studies in those jurisdictions. But a nice surprise is that almost a third of our studies are now coming out of North America. This is different. This has been a change in the landscape since we did the original review. Talking about study design, so you'll recall that Dwayne mentioned one of the important things was it needed to be an intervention study, and it needed to have a comparison group. And so we are very happy to say that most of the studies, remember we had 27 studies in total, so at least 20 of them, whoops, oh dear, are randomized controlled trials, which is nice because remember these are studies investigating these interventions at workplaces. Several studies are of this non-randomized comparison group, so they may have natural groups already emerging, maybe one work unit and another work unit, and they offered the intervention in one work unit so they could see if it made a difference. And we have very few studies now that are single groups that were just studied before and after. So that's nice. The quality of the evidence in this field has grown since we did the original review. Outcomes of interest. So recall that the outcomes needed to be something relevant to the workplace. So we had 3 main outcomes: return to work, stay at work, and recurrences, tracking episodes where people were off work, returned, and then had to leave work again. And again, you can see that primarily most studies are thinking about this at a return to work stage. Someone has had to leave work. They offer an intervention to help them make a transition back to work. But emerging in this body of literature is more focused on trying to help people with symptoms function while at work instead of needing to take time away from work. And this part over here on recurrences, I like to think of this as a glass half full, because when we did the original review, there were no studies looking at what's happening long term. Once somebody has returned to work, is that it? Or do we have, we know this condition is episodic in nature, so do these interventions help keep them in work, or do they continue to have episodes away from work? And now we're seeing more studies that are focusing on tracking that longer term. Okay, so here's the exciting part. What were the interventions that we found? We found 13 different kinds of interventions, and I'll go through them fairly quickly. We have 3 that you'll see are bolded and above the yellow line, and then we have 10 that are below the yellow line. So what does that yellow line mean? The yellow line tells us that if you recall that slide Dwayne showed about our algorithm for how we determine what are the levels of evidence in this body of literature, part of that was based on quantity of studies, number of studies that have looked at these interventions. And so those that are below the line are in groups where there were too few studies for us to really move a synthesis forward. It doesn't mean, we're going to park them today right now, but it doesn't mean that these don't work. We don't know that for sure. It's just that because there aren't enough studies to help guide a synthesis, we're not making any judgments about them at this point. What are the 3 above the line? Those are the ones we're going to focus on moving forward. So I'm going to, on the next slide, define them for you. But we have 3: enhanced care, cognitive behavioral therapy, and something we're calling work-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. Okay, so talking just about those 3 different types of interventions, let's start with enhanced care. This was an intervention that was primarily offered to the clinicians, the healthcare provider team. So it wasn't necessarily the worker that was being given the intervention. It was about providing better care to those workers. So the target were the actual healthcare providers. And they labeled this as something that we're calling enhancement of usual care. It allowed for better integration and communication among healthcare providers that are involved in these cases. And they were given specific training in the diagnosis and treatment of this disorder, specifically related to helping in return to work, helping people to make that transition. We're clear about that? Okay. So if we turn to cognitive behavioral therapy, we're pulling the definition for this intervention from CAMH, which is based on a positive shared therapeutic relationship between the therapist and the client. And there are several elements that are unique features that belong to a cognitive behavioral therapy intervention. And those are that this intervention is quite structured, it's time limited, it's problem focused and goal directed, and it teaches the individual strategies and skills. So it's quite individualistic. Most of the time the individual will come in and say, these are the issues I need to resolve, and they work on planning strategies that they can use when they have those issues crop up, and skills on how they can manage their symptoms related to their specific problems that they've identified. Okay? So what's the difference between that and work-focused CBT? Here, those strategies and skills are targeting work-relevant problems. So in the period of time when they're saying, what's my issue? How do I resolve these problems I've got? Work-focused CBT, the issues and the problems they're targeting are around the transition back to work. So I know I have to get back to work. When I do that, I'm going to have to engage with my supervisor, and what kind of strategies do I need in order for that to happen is an example. Okay, so the actual focus of the CBT is on work-relevant problems and goals to manage those. Cindy.
Just a clarification, under enhanced care, who are the caregivers that need to be trained in diagnosis and treatment? Because that wouldn't be the physicians.
It was physicians.
They needed to be trained in that?
Some of them.
Okay.
So this was primarily an intervention offered in European jurisdictions, and they have different kinds of physicians that might interact with employees. So where this was relevant, they were teaching them how to follow the guidelines.
Right.
But it wasn't just physicians. There were other healthcare team members involved. Okay. The next slide is the really exciting slide. This is what we found. So just to orient you to the table here, on the left-hand side, we've got the 3 intervention types. Those are our acronyms: enhanced care, CBT, or work-focused CBT. At the bottom here is our legend, so if you see a positive, it means the intervention improved the outcome. If you see an equal sign, it means the intervention had no effect on the outcome. And if you were to see a negative sign, which we don't have in this case, it would mean the intervention actually makes the outcome worse. Okay? So starting with stay at work, this is what the evidence looked like across those 3 interventions. There was mixed evidence that enhanced care actually helped people stay at work and manage their symptoms while working well at work. There was strong evidence that CBT and moderate evidence that work-focused CBT helped people stay at work. Okay. In terms of return to work, what we see here is that unless it's focused on work, the interventions seem not to help improve the transition of time away from work back to work. But when the intervention is focused on work solutions for CBT, it has an effect. There is a moderate level of evidence that this intervention can help people return to work. So really what we're seeing here is a gradient effect. That when people are already functioning at work, they can use maybe a less intense therapeutic intervention. But when they are out of the workplace, they need more individual tailored responses to help them in that transition. It needs to be a more targeted and focused intervention. And then turning finally to recurrences, where you see no evidence, that means no studies looked at it. So enhanced care, the studies looking at enhanced care hadn't tracked long enough to see recurrences. In terms of the CBT studies, whether it was CBT alone or CBT focused on work solutions, the evidence is pointing to that these interventions may not be exactly where we need to be to help people avoid recurrent absences. So putting that into some language, some words, for workers who are managing their symptoms while at work, they haven't had to leave work, it looks like CBT is effective whether or not it's focused specifically on strategies at work. For workers who are experiencing a work absence, they have had to take time away from work due to their symptoms, there is a gradient effect, and that suggests that workers need more therapeutic support and a focus on identifying work-relevant strategies related to their specific needs with return to work to help that transition. And in terms of recurrences, I think there needs to be more work to be done. At this point, those interventions on their own aren't helping us keep people from avoiding recurrent absences. So the really neat thing about this review was that because we had more studies, we could actually start to look into the ways that the interventions were offered and to see if there were particular nuggets about, do you need the intervention to be given by a clinician? Can it be given online, etc.? So we looked into what did the literature say about that, and this is the first one. So we asked the question of our studies, the pool of studies we found, does it matter whether the CBT is offered by a clinician or a non-clinician? The non-clinicians could have been peer mentors, someone who had been through this experience before and then were helping to provide care to injured workers at their workplace. Here's the picture. So very few studies have actually looked at non-clinician-led interventions. You can see the numbers here. So studies that were actually asking the question, will those interventions help people return to work? There were only 2 of them. And there was only 1 study that had looked at, could a non-clinician give this intervention and help people stay at work? But of those 3 studies, what we can see is they seem to have a positive effect on these outcomes. So that's a promising statement, but more work should be done to look into that further. Yeah.
Non-clinicians were just kind of other workplace parties, or would they also be kind of counselors, or I'm just trying to understand who fit into the non-clinician.
So if they would be considered a regulated health profession, they would fit under clinician. But if they were not, then they would be what we deem non-clinicians. Primarily this literature, it were peer-to-peer, but we did have one study where it was somebody who was a labor expert, an expert in understanding how people deal with return to work, but not a clinician. Yes?
So where is the social worker then? Is that a clinician or not?
Well, the answer to that question may be a bit irrelevant because we didn't have any interventions offered by a social worker. But I think we would, if they weren't considered a regulated health profession, we wouldn't have labeled them as a clinician. Yes?
You mentioned online interventions.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that 2 slides away. Okay, any other clarification questions about this breakdown? So this is not information, you'll not hear us use our levels of evidence here because there were not enough studies to help guide practice, but this is an emerging thing. This might be worth continuing to do some investigation on. We also asked the question, could this CBT program be offered in group settings, or does it need to be offered one-on-one to individuals? And the literature had something to say about that, so we looked at what those studies looked like. Again, we're talking about a small number of studies that have actually looked at group-based interventions. Most of the studies have focused on CBT as an individual one-on-one treatment. But we've got 2 studies that have focused on return to work and 2 that have focused on stay at work. And when we look at what that literature says, they also seem to have a positive effect. So this is a feasibility potentially issue, right? If we can offer it in a group setting, that might be easier to do in a workplace setting. It's something that's worth continuing to explore. And then you had the question about alternate delivery. So that was what we asked of the literature as well. Some of the interventions most were in person, either individual or group, but we did have some studies that had tried alternate modes of delivery. So phone-based, where you're on an actual call with somebody, or online-based, where you were interacting with a system, and then primarily those systems would also have a clinician involved who was reviewing your work and working on targeting the program to you. It wasn't just you in a black box and never any clinician interaction. But what did that look like? Here there were more studies, so we're actually able to offer a level of evidence on this, and there is moderate evidence that these different types of interventions can help people stay at work. But we can't go so far to talk about return to work, and that's partly due to where the number of studies that have looked at that are. It doesn't necessarily mean it wouldn't work, it's just we can't comment. Does that help?
It does, but you didn't mention the ends either.
Yeah, I meant to pull that up. I can look for it, but I didn't have them on the slide, and I thought this morning, I should figure out how many studies. But it would mean if I'm not going to give you a flip view through all of the slides, but we can go back to the algorithm at the end. But it would mean there needed to be at least 3 studies that were all saying the same thing in order to give that level of evidence. So at the very least, there would be 3, but it may be more. I can't remember. Yes?
And this is just where CBT is addressing depression.
Yes, so our focus was simply on depression. So if it was offered to one of those other conditions that we excluded, we wouldn't have that in our sample to talk about. Yeah. It is worth mentioning that there were a lot of relevant interventions that may not have had any focus on work. So they may only have been saying, does this intervention reduce symptoms? Those also aren't part of our pool because they weren't focused on work outcomes. Okay, so let's think about putting these findings into context. So if I put this set of potential interventions or factors we know to be associated with mental health issues in the workplace, on the left-hand side, you can see that primarily these are things that we found in this body of literature. On the right-hand side are things that really weren't captured, but we know are important in the managing depression at work. And so one of the things we did is we thought, well, can we sort them? Can we classify these various things? And we thought, yes, we can. We can actually see that some of these ones over here on the left are focused. The intervention, the target of the intervention is the individual. Let's build up your resilience and your coping skills to be able to manage your symptoms in your work setting. Those that are on the right-hand side are more organizational, work organization factors, things that workplaces could change or intervene on that change work processes, culture, education at work. And here's an interesting thing. When we think about those 13 types of interventions across the 27 studies that we asked this question of, the literature has a lot to say, a lot more to say, about how we can help workers be more resilient and increase their coping skills. But there has been very little work, in fact, we found no studies, focusing on interventions to deal with these organizational factors. We know these have been studied extensively, but we haven't seen any interventions where somebody has said, let's go in and change the work process and see if that can influence the outcomes that we were studying in this review. That's not to say that workplaces aren't doing those things. Right? We know that workplaces have to solve problems that the research literature isn't there to help guide them with. But it is important to notice that the research literature really hasn't looked at evaluating those types of interventions in a peer-reviewed way. So what did we do with this information? So one of the things that was interesting to us is we knew, as I just said, that we knew that workplaces are trying to solve these issues where there is no evidence to guide them. So we started another project, which I'm just going to really briefly mention, that was used to help us develop a guide for workplace parties that was funded out of WorkSafe BC. And what we did in this study was we said, we know that there is evidence that people are solving these problems, that practitioners have solutions, that workers who are experiencing these interventions at work can tell us whether they're helping them or not helping them. And so we did a mixed methods study where we had this research evidence. This was the summary that I just shared with you. And we captured information in survey form and in focus group and interviews from practitioners in the field. So those would be people who have responsibilities to help manage people with depression at work. So they could be HR people, they could be occupational health and safety representatives, disability management professionals. And we asked them things like, what are you doing? What are the services you provide? What do you think of those services? And we asked workers the same set of things. So those that have had symptoms, what has been offered to you? Who do you interact with about these things, and what's working, what's not working? And we use that information to develop a guide for practice. And it's so hot off the presses that it's still under embargo. We can't even really talk more about it. But as Emma said, we could potentially have another plenary to talk about those findings as well. So the outcome of these projects that we've done is the original project that led to us taking a look at the systematic review, the evidence in context for occupational health and safety, the one that Emma had described. We have generated a handbook on how you might do that. How might you take evidence and contextualize it for your specific situation to take the question, what works, and answer the question, will it work here? We've created a guide, and that's available on our website. We also have the very early preliminary findings from this review available on the website. And then the new one that I can't talk a lot about at this point is the summary of the project I just mentioned to you, which is our guide for supporting people with depression in the workplace. We hope to have that available, if not this quarter, then this spring.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Do we have questions?
Thank you. I have two very, I guess, short questions, if I may.
Yes.
I'm very surprised that there's nothing about supervisor competency training, and we didn't find anything on that, given the amount of resources that organisations seem to be currently investing in training supervisors about managing employees. I just was wondering if you would comment on that. And then two, around the difference in estimates, you've sort of indicated in the same direction, but are they the same? So is individual training, does it have a stronger effect than group training, even though they're both positive?
Can I ask that you try to repeat the question? We have a lot of people on the webinar.
Sure. Did you want? I put the microphone down, so it's whoever reaches for it first that gets to answer. Okay, let me try tackling. I've already forgotten how you phrased your first question.
Just about the supervisor competency.
Oh yes. Okay, so the first question was about why we might not have seen more interventions targeting supervisors on being competent to manage individuals with these symptoms. Yeah. It's a good question. I know that we have seen that for musculoskeletal health. So we, in a review that was an earlier review that we also included mental health conditions in, we did find some emerging work around training the supervisors. But in depression, we have not. So part of that could be due to the fact that they've included other conditions that weren't relevant, but also it may still be a very emerging thing in mental health. Okay. Your second question was about the magnitude of effect, right? So studies may have all been pointing the same direction, but did they have the same magnitude of effect? And so part of the issue with that is that they didn't always necessarily measure the outcome in the exact same way, which makes it hard to do that kind of analysis. And it is part of the reason why we use that algorithm to simply understand direction of effect. We do consider those issues in our quality appraisal. So that helps to determine whether studies get higher rankings or not. But any?
I think just the first one, just a point in time that we need to track.
Yeah.
I missed that completely.
we are in agreement over here.
I think it's just that when we look at the maturity of literature coming out of the area of musculoskeletal disorders and where we've got to be able to say something about supervisor training over, 2 decades, when you think about when I think that, this is more emerging, so it'd be really neat to track that over time, and that's one of the things that we do with our fabulous library is to track exactly that.
Yeah, so I was a little bit curious about the difference in the results for the stay at work as compared to the recurrence. Because, so part of me feels like, well, isn't that pretty much the same thing, and why would those results be different? And I guess the question to you is, A, can you comment on that, but is that a matter of the recurrence being more almost a preventive thing? So it's before the symptoms are even happening that maybe CBT isn't very effective at preventing the symptoms from coming back, but once the symptoms are there, it's reasonably effective at kind of keeping them under control, or if there's something else going on with it.
So just to paraphrase your question for the listeners online, I think you were interested in the difference in the relationship around stay at work and recurrences, and in some way they're looking at the similar thing, trying to keep people functioning at work. So part of it, I think, may be, first of all the subjects in these studies had to already have symptoms. So none of the studies were primary prevention, which we know exists, right? But these people had already identified as having symptoms, and they were taking these interventions to help manage their symptoms. So why would that be different than people who have now transitioned back to work and are trying to manage their symptoms and avoid a recurrence? And I think I almost talked about this when I showed the slides, but chose not to, because it's something we don't know a lot about. And I think it's possible that if we tracked those people who were stay-at-work studies, we might have seen them eventually have an absence. And so it could just be that there becomes a point in time where that's not enough. And I think that's something that we need to explore farther. Is there any other? Yes. Well, yeah, so also with the recurrences, there were, sorry, Dwayne.
He opened his mouth.
I'm not giving you the microphone. So with the recurrence studies, there were only 5 of them that had looked at recurrences, and they may not have all focused on issues around the same type of intervention. So that would be part of it.
Part of what I'm hearing from you, Phil, that it may be a severity of the condition. That again, the initial one, when it's coming on, it may be effective for those where it's a less severe whatever, and this stuff is helpful, but for those where that didn't work even at the time, and they're now off, and then it's a recurrence, it's still not enough to really call for something.
Yeah, I think the complicated nature of looking at recurrences, but that also feeds into it's more difficult to do that research. Right. And so both of those things, I think, are part of the answer. Yeah. So it's more challenging to do the research. The research, we don't have as many studies in that case.
That was my question. So.
All right. Right here. And then we have someone online, but we'll let you go first. Sorry, your name?
Doug Sam.
Doug. And then online. Okay.
So I have a number of questions. Some are kind of definitional in terms of your definitional premises. So, for example, depression. There are several ranges from severity. It ranges from the standpoint of what you're talking about, adjustment disorder, depressed mood, dysthymia, major depressive disorder, psychotic depression that can occur. So, is it what is the minimum kind of diagnostic definition? To start with, do you recall?
So to back up, so we did have a lot of debate about this within the original review. So we took the original depression because this was an update, and the original diagnostic, I cannot remember the exact code that we used, but it was in consultation. One of the leads of the project was a psychiatrist, and we had 3 other psychiatrists on the team, and we did debate this not just with the psychiatrists, but also workplaces. So it was the minimum condition that people would be functioning in a workplace environment was the diagnosis that we took. Is that?
I see, okay. In terms of CBT, was that the entire definition that was presented there? Because that's really not a classical definition of CBT from the classical psychological perspective, the one that was presented from CAMH.
So, did you want to? You want me to do that too? Excellent. So it was the definition that we took from CAMH, and it's interesting that you bring up this point because we've given many presentations where we put that definition up and asked people to challenge it, and I think you're the first one to give us any feedback. Not that people potentially didn't challenge it, but they've actually asked us to, because we felt that we needed one definition. We looked at a number of definitions. We needed to land on one. We wanted to be transparent so that people understood the perspective we were bringing, and that was the one that we ended up with. Anything to add?
Maybe just to say that there is more around the definition from CAMH, but only so many words put on the slide. So we picked on the high points to present for this.
So was it on their website? Or
Yes. Yeah, we took it directly. And we also had members of CAMH on the team as well. So that's not the reason we picked it. We picked it independently, but we did have them on the team as well. Okay.
Maybe we have someone on the webinar.
I'll make it easy for you.
So given that cognitive behavioral therapy delivered by non-clinicians is looking promising, did you find out from any of the studies whether or not there was a particular way they went about it, and what would it take to get somebody up to speed, a supervisor or a peer, to deliver cognitive behavioral therapy?
That's a great question. So will the people online have heard that from here? Perfect. I don't have to repeat it. So the answer really, unfortunately, is no. Really, you'd need a process evaluation study to look at some of the nuances about why it works or what you might need to do to make it work. And these were studies looking at effectiveness on the outcome. So they delivered these interventions, and they may not have told us enough details for us to understand what it was about what they offered that made it effective.
That's my question, so I can say thank you. Wonderful presentation, thank you so much. I'm kind of having a question more about in the measurement space. So you have 20 randomized controlled trials in which I understand the people who had symptoms were randomized to at least 2 types of treatments. Can you comment what type of the treatment was given to a placebo group in that case? I understand they might be variability between the studies, but at least maybe some clues.
No one else is reaching for the mic. So the question was, in the randomized control trials, could we talk a little bit about what the control treatment looked like across those different studies? And so you were really right on. They didn't always look the same, but many of them are coming out of the European Union, and they're offering pretty standard guideline-based treatments. So quite often those studies were this enhanced care. We're going to target those individuals that provide care versus delivering the guideline without this enhancement of care. So many of the studies had very similar control group experiences, what would be often considered usual care. But those usual cares would look a lot alike across those studies.
Is it more or less possible to say what was the length of the treatment? For how long they, like, if it's CBT, is it a couple of sessions? Is it a few months? I mean, I'm more towards those responses.
response team here?
Yeah, good question. So, in general, the CBT is 8 to 12 structured sessions. They could have been offered on different schedules, so some may have had them, once a month, or some of them may have had them every couple of weeks. Those were a little different. But in terms of follow-up, I've forgotten our actual criteria, but it had to be, I think, at least 3 months of follow-up. And most of the studies followed people for at least one full calendar year.
I'm interested in the work CBT. Was there a sense that work CBT was because there was something dysfunctional potentially at the workplace, or there were poor interpersonal work relationships, and so they wanted to focus on managing those because they might be precipitating a depressive episode? Or was it really just that work is an environment that is different from some others and we should be giving it attention?
You want to do it?
Okay. I think in this instance, what we found is that somebody came up with an intervention that was work-focused. So I don't know that there was a particular target based on the clients so much as this was a new idea to increase the opportunity to get people back to work. So it's more about what was offered, and then to tie in Vicky's question, then we would compare that to non-work focused CBT perhaps. In some of the studies that's what was done. So it was more the intervention availability or development.
And the target wasn't necessarily on workplaces that were a problem and people were trying to solve those problems as part of the intervention. It was just, here's an important thing for you to be able to do. Let's focus on how we can help you do that.
Okay. Okay.
Can you just speak to that comparison between work-focused CBT and CBT? For the work-focused studies, was the comparison group usual care or CBT?
Well,
Both.
yes.
Who wants that
usual
question?
care could be CBT.
So if there was a CBT group, there was often also a third group that was given something different, a usual care. But many of the studies were comparing traditional CBT versus a work-focused CBT and looking at, does that improve the outcomes around work?
We have time for one final question.
I think I'll try to kind of blend two, if that's okay. And this goes to, I think, really the intersection of more the organizational, speaking of both workplace fit for individuals, the workplace meaning the actual job fit for the individual relative to skills and interests and aptitudes and the like, but also in terms of accommodations. So is it more that when you're looking at the organizational interventions and the lack of studies, is it that the lack of studies don't meet threshold, or that there virtually are no studies?
So to repeat the question, you're asking about whether there are as many studies in the organizational side as the individual focus side? Is that a fair?
There aren't.
No, there aren't.
But is it that?
There weren't the studies, or was it that they did not meet our threshold?
Right, and
criteria?
it was they were not the studies. Yeah, they're not there yet, and I think that ties in with what Peter was asking earlier, that they're just not there yet. It takes researchers a little while to catch up to with the interventions that are out there in the workplace. And I think that allows me to say that that does not mean that those interventions are not effective. So in the interventions that we talked about that had a single study, or in the interventions that are not yet studied, they may well be very effective, but we can't comment on the level of evidence until there are enough studies to do so. So that's important message to say as well.
Well, and I think the other, you had a whole other question.
Yeah, and just to clarify around the work demands fit, is there much, I don't know if it really came into either basket, but is there much really looking at
in factor.
fit between the worker and demands of the workplace.
Merging, maybe?
So the question was, has there been studies looking at the fit between the demands of work and the workplace and the worker? Is that? And the answer to that question is there has been a lot of work looking at the association between these different factors and the outcomes of interest to us. But they aren't intervention studies. So they didn't fit into our definition for this review, which is they needed to be trying to make a change happen on one of these issues. So they're not captured in this review.
Like your sense of the importance of that relative to depression and interventions.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, it's an important component, yeah.
I think also just to sort of bring all of these questions around, I think we're very much that the glass is very half full at this point. It's when you look at 5 years between the first and the update, we weren't able to say anything, like nothing. And at this point, we're actually able to not only have some messages, but also sort of look at some of the components of those broader messages in terms of the delivery method, who was delivering. So it's very exciting that even talking about recurrences, that was just, a dream 5 years before. So it really is, all of these questions I think are really important, and the important thing is to put this in the paper so that we can advance the intervention studies so that we are able to say something a bit more definitive. So we're very, very excited, and excited that you're all sort of thinking along the same lines of the importance of a lot of these components. So.
On that note, thank you for that summing up, Emma. That was perfect. Thank you very much.